for a week. But his flight never left the ground. That was the first crack in the illusion. A glitch in the perfect image of Daniel Ross, the man everyone in the company called the miracle CFO. To me, he was more than that. He was my boss, my mentor, and for the past 3 years, the reason I believed loyalty still meant something in the corporate world. My name's Aidan Cole, junior financial analyst at Stratwell Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing firm that grew faster than anyone predicted. We made industrial parts, but Daniel made us believe we were changing the world. Smooth talker. Expensive suits. Always smiling. The kind of man who could charm auditors and intimidate board members in the same breath. He noticed me early, called me sharp, efficient, and board material. For a 28-year-old working 14-hour days. Those words meant everything. I thought I was being groomed for greatness. I didn't realize I was being positioned as cover. The business trip was announced on a Thursday morning. Daniel walked into the office with his usual flair, coffee in hand, Bluetooth earpiece glowing, already mid-conversation about foreign investors and partnership expansion. "Aidan, I'll need you to manage my reports while I'm in Dubai," he said. "You're the only one I trust with the numbers." The room watched, impressed. Me, I felt proud, until I noticed one thing. He'd said Dubai, but the travel authorization email I processed listed Singapore. Small detail. I told myself it was a clerical mix-up. It wasn't. That week, something felt off. Daniel's trip started with daily updates, photos of meetings, coffee with clients, a skyline shot. Except every photo looked staged. The lighting was off. The backgrounds were oddly generic, like stock images. Then came the silence. No more messages. No check-ins. Still his expense claims kept rolling in. Thousands in conference fees, client entertainment, and private consultant sessions. I approved the first few without hesitation, because who questions the CFO? But when one receipt showed the same hotel address as a local luxury suite in our own city, I froze. Why would a man in Dubai be billing from a place 20 minutes from headquarters? The unease grew into obsession. I started cross-checking his transaction logs after hours. Tiny irregularities appeared, slight mismatches in vendor names, repeated invoice codes, and payments looping through holding accounts that didn't belong to any recognized client. Each night I told myself to stop digging. Each morning I dug deeper. And then, I found it. A single transaction dated 2 days after his supposed flight, or 12,500 wired to a consulting firm that didn't exist. The firm's registration number traced back to a shell company. The shell company was registered under D. Ross Holdings, LLC. That was the moment my admiration died, but I couldn't accuse him. Not yet. Daniel was powerful, protected, and dangerous. If I went in unarmed, I'd lose my job before I could even explain. So, I played along. I smiled in meetings, approved his reimbursements, and pretended I hadn't noticed the trail of money leading into the dark. But every good lie has a flaw. Daniel's came on the 5th day of his trip. That morning, while updating expense sheets, I saw a reflection in the office elevator mirror. Him. The man who was supposed to be thousands of miles away. Standing right there, wearing sunglasses and carrying a briefcase. He froze when our eyes met. Then he smiled. "Aidan, not a word to anyone, all right? Business trips get complicated." He winked, like it was a joke. But I wasn't laughing. Because in that briefcase, I caught a glimpse of something, a folder labeled, Board Review Q4 Confidential. And on its corner, I saw a printed figure circled in reds, 228,000. That's when the real story began. The moment suspicion turned into certainty, and loyalty became a weapon. Because if Daniel thought I'd stay silent, he hadn't learned who I really was. Some betrayals don't happen overnight. They drip, one lie at a time. After that elevator moment, I couldn't unsee the truth. Daniel wasn't in Dubai. He was right here, hiding in plain sight, and smiling like he owned the lie. But in a company like Stratwell Industries, suspicion isn't enough. Accuse the CFO without proof, and you're finished. So I buried my reaction under layers of fake calm and routine reports. Still, the cracks were spreading. The first red flag came on Monday morning. Daniel returned to the office officially. Jet, lagged smile, suitcase, the whole performance. The team gathered to welcome him back, clapping like trained seals. Great to be home, he laughed. Dubai was brutal, but productive. He handed out souvenirs, gold pens, keychains, even a miniature Burj Khalifa paperweight for me. For my best man, he said, clapping my shoulder. It would have been flattering if I hadn't already seen him standing in our elevator 5 days earlier. That night, I stared at the paperweight on my desk. It looked cheap. Plastic, not metal. I turned it over. A tiny sticker on the base said, "Made in China, retail value, $3.99. That's when I realized Daniel's trip wasn't the only fake thing about him. Then came the favoritism. Daniel had always been friendly, but suddenly he was too friendly. He called me into his office almost daily, locking the door behind him, lowering his voice. "You're going places, Aiden," he'd say, leaning back in his leather chair. "You're smart enough to know when to stay quiet, and let the grown-ups handle the tough stuff." The words were praise, but the tone felt like a warning. He'd slip subtle instructions into our conversations. "Don't worry about verifying these invoices. I'll sign off myself. Skip the audit trail this time, it'll just slow us down." Every time he said, "Trust me." I trusted him a little less. The second red flag was the secret phone calls. Daniel's office shared a glass wall with mine. He had blinds, but rarely used them, until that month. Suddenly, they were closed more than open. One evening, when most of the staff had left, I heard him through the thin partition, pacing, whispering sharply. "No, not yet," I said after the review meeting. "Yes. The same account. The new one. I don't care what the ledger says, just make it disappear." I froze. The next morning he was back to his usual self, loud, confident, untouchable. When I asked casually, "Rough night, sir?" he smiled without missing a beat. "Just talking to investors in Singapore. Time zones, you know." Except the clock on his desk had the Singapore time zone already. And it was 3 p.m. there. The third red flag was the money itself. Daniel handled nearly all of Stratwell's financial transactions personally. A privilege granted by the CEO, who saw him as the company's financial conscience. But over the next few weeks, that conscience started looking very selective. Vendor payments began getting delayed, except for a few special partners. Only Daniel seemed to know. When our accountant, Mira, questioned it, Daniel brushed her off. "We're optimizing the cash flow. You wouldn't understand the strategy." Later that day, Mira confided in me, lowering her voice so the cameras wouldn't catch. "Aiden, 3 payments bounced last week. That's never happened before. Someone's moving money without recording it." I told her I'd look into it. But we both knew what that meant: stay quiet, or become a target. The fourth red flag was unfair treatment. Not toward me, but toward others. Daniel started pushing out anyone who asked too many questions. First, the compliance officer resigned suddenly. Then a senior analyst got transferred to a remote branch. Both had been working closely on expense verifications. When I asked if we'd replace them, Daniel smiled. "No need. You'll handle their tasks now. I trust you." It wasn't a promotion, it was surveillance. He wanted me close. Inside the system he was bleeding dry. And yet, a part of me stayed. Not because I was loyal, but because I needed to see it all. But the longer I stayed, the heavier it got. The late nights blurred into each other. Spreadsheets, missing ledgers, fake invoices. My eyes ached, my hands shook. Coffee became dinner. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., replaying his voice in my head. "You're smart enough to stay quiet." Quiet like the others who'd vanished. Quiet like Mira, who suddenly went on extended leave. I checked the HR portal. Her profile was gone. Just erased. Something dark was happening behind those boardroom doors. And somehow, Daniel believed he could keep me on his leash while he siphoned the company dry. But he underestimated one thing. Numbers never lie. The fifth and final red flag hit like a punch to the gut. It was Friday evening, and I was finishing the quarterly report Daniel had delegated to me. While pulling old statements for reference, I noticed 2 nearly identical invoices. Same vendor, same date, same amount. Only one difference: the account number. One led to a legitimate supplier. The other led to a bank account ending in 4428. I cross-checked it. The account belonged to a private consultancy, Owner Daniel Ross. My hands went cold. The same man who taught me how to spot fraud had built his own maze of deception, and I was standing right in the center. That night, I sat alone in the office, staring at the city lights flickering beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably drinking, laughing, feeling untouchable. And me? I was the quiet analyst with a folder of ghosts, numbers that didn't add up, voices that went missing, and a boss who faked a business trip to hide a $280K lie. I didn't know how to fight him yet. But I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't act soon, I'd be next. Every number tells a story. Daniel once told me. He was right. I just hadn't realized yet. His story was about to end. Betrayal isn't loud. It hides behind signatures, receipts, and smiles. For weeks, I'd convinced myself I might be wrong. That Daniel's odd behavior was just corporate politics, or stress, or ambition gone sideways. But numbers don't lie. And the numbers I'd found were screaming. The more I dug, the deeper the rot went. It started with the duplicate invoices. 2 payments of $9,400 each, processed under different vendors but sharing identical descriptions. The signatures were his, but one of the approvals had my name forged next to it. I sat there staring at it, my chest tightening. My name. My initials. My job. He was using me as his cover. The system showed the transfer had already been verified by the bank. But when I tracked the payment path, it bounced between 2 shell companies, before landing in a personal account under D. Ross Holdings LLC, the same company he used to hide that earlier $12,500 transfer. That was the moment I realized what the title of this whole nightmare really meant. He'd faked an entire business trip to steal company funds. For $228,000 and counting. The fraud wasn't a single transaction. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Over 6 months, Daniel had created fake overseas vendors, complete with websites, email addresses, and invoices that looked flawless at first glance. He billed them for consulting, international logistics, and market expansion. But the accounts led back to him. The Dubai trip was just a cover. A distraction while he moved the final chunk of money out of Stratwell's operational fund. And the worst part? He'd used my credentials to approve it all. Every stolen dollar had my digital signature beneath it. When the truth sank in, I couldn't breathe. I scrolled through the files again, hoping I'd made a mistake. Hoping maybe it was an error, a coincidence. But it wasn't. Each transfer had a pattern, random amounts that added up to something precise, $228,000. Enough to stay under audit thresholds. Enough to look like routine expenses. Enough to ruin me completely if the board found out before I could prove he'd forged everything. Daniel hadn't just betrayed the company. He'd betrayed me. The next morning, he was waiting for me in his office, smiling like always. "Morning, champ," he said, tossing a folder across the table. "Need you to finalize this week's expense summary." I opened it. Inside were 3 more fake invoices, already signed. I looked up at him, my pulse pounding. "These vendors don't exist," I said quietly. He leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You've been doing your homework." That tone, calm, confident, poisonous, made my stomach turn. "You forged my approvals," I said, louder this time. "You're stealing from the company." Daniel didn't flinch. He just smiled wider. "Aiden, I built this company's financial system. You think I'd leave a paper trail? If I go down, you go down with me." My throat went dry. He was right. Everything was under my name. He stood, circling behind me like a predator. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You're smart, but not smart enough. Learn when to stay quiet. Or you'll end up jobless before you even know it." Then he walked out, leaving the faint smell of cologne and corruption behind him. For the next few days, I could barely function. I'd sit at my desk, pretending to work, while my mind replayed that conversation on loop. He'd planned everything: the fake trip, the forged signatures, the emotional manipulation. I wasn't his protégé. I was his shield. Each mentorship session had just been a rehearsal for this moment, training me to trust him enough to sign things without question. And now he was daring me to fight back. That Friday, something inside me broke. Mira, the accountant who'd gone on leave, texted me from an unknown number. "Check the server backups. Folder name Q4 Tiravel Doses." Password the city he lied about. My hands shook as I typed Dubai into the password field. The folder opened, hundreds of PDFs. Fake itineraries, fake invoices, fake hotel bookings, all created within 2 days of his supposed departure. One file stood out: expensive log signature proof. PDF. I clicked. It was a scanned image of my signature, lifted from an old onboarding form, cropped, and pasted onto financial documents. I stared at it until my vision blurred. Every approval he'd filed had my forged signature attached. If the auditors saw this before I could explain, I'd be branded the thief. That's when the heartbreak turned into something colder. Rage. I packed my laptop, the folder, and Mira's message into a secure drive. If Daniel thought he could erase me, he'd underestimated how much truth I'd already collected. But fears still gnawed at me. What if he found out I'd accessed the server? What if Mira was caught helping me? I locked the evidence in my desk drawer and walked out of the office that night feeling like I was being followed. And maybe I was. Because as I reached my car, a black SUV rolled slowly past the lot. Tinted windows. Engine humming, no plates I could recognize. Then, a text vibrated on my phone. Unknown, stop digging, Aiden. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floor, every vibration of my phone made my chest tighten. But under the fear, something else was growing: resolve. Daniel had turned me into his scapegoat, used my name to steal $228K, and threatened my future. He thought I'd stay quiet. He thought I'd be too scared to fight. But he didn't know what it felt like to lose everything you believed in. He didn't know what I'd do when I had nothing left to protect. Except the truth. You taught me to follow the money, Daniel. I whispered into the dark. Now I'm following yours. Sometimes strength doesn't come from bravery. It comes from running out of ways to be afraid. For 3 nights, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, Daniel's smirk, his calm voice, that whisper. If I go down, you go down with me. It replayed until it stopped sounding like a threat and started sounding like a challenge. He thought he'd built an unbreakable trap. But he forgot one thing. I knew his system better than anyone. The trigger came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen table, coffee going cold beside a pile of documents I couldn't bring myself to look at anymore. My apartment felt smaller than usual, boxed in by the silence of uncertainty. On the table lay that stupid Burj Khalifa paperweight. The cheap souvenir he'd handed me, still sitting there like a trophy of lies. I stared at it for a long time. Then, without thinking, I hurled it across the room. It hit the wall, shattered, and something small rolled across the floor. A micro SD card. For a moment, I couldn't move. I picked it up, turned it in the light. It was labeled with black marker, Q4B key. My pulse spiked. I ran to my laptop, inserted the card, and opened the files. Inside were dozens of internal documents, payroll records, payment logs, and audio recordings. I clicked the first one. Daniel's voice filled the room. Move the funds to the consulting account. No, don't copy the board on this. Aiden's signature is on file. Just process it. My blood went cold. He'd hidden the evidence of his own fraud inside the fake souvenir he'd given me, like a twisted joke. And now, by sheer accident, I had it. I spent the next 6 hours combing through every file on that card. Each one was worse than the last. Fake expense claims, private transfers, voice memos where Daniel planned his trip, even emails instructing subordinates to falsify receipts. It wasn't just about money. He'd been using company funds to pay off personal debts, buying property under a relative's name, and covering it up as international consulting expenses. The total wasn't $128K anymore. It was closer to 310 zlozen. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It was personal, intimate, cruel. He'd built me up only to use me as camouflage. He hadn't chosen me for my talent. He'd chosen me for my obedience. And that's when something inside me shifted. I closed the laptop and looked around my apartment. The empty coffee cups, the unpaid bills, the exhaustion carved into my reflection in the glass. For months, I'd been scared of losing my job, my reputation, my safety. But Daniel had already taken all that from me. Fear had nothing left to feed on. I whispered out loud, half to myself, half to the ghosts in my head, he's not the genius. I am. That single sentence changed everything. Because the truth wasn't his to hide anymore. It was mine to weaponize. The next morning, I walked into Stratwell like nothing had happened. Daniel was in early, laughing with the CEO, charming as ever. When he saw me, he gave that familiar grin. You look tired, Aiden. Burnout's real, you know. Don't let the stress get to you. I smiled back. You're right. I've been thinking I should start documenting things more carefully. He paused, just for a second. A flicker of tension in his eyes. Then he chuckled and walked away. Good, he didn't know yet. Over the next few days, I built my plan in silence. I created a shadow archive. A secure, offline folder with all his forged documents, hidden transactions, and audio evidence. Then I started planting subtle questions in team meetings, nudging others to notice the inconsistencies I already knew existed. When Daniel said he was reviewing quarterly budgets, I casually asked, which ones? The Dubai accounts or the Singapore ones? He froze for half a second, then recovered with a joke. But I saw it, that tiny flicker of panic. It felt good. Still, I needed more. The recordings were damning. But the board wouldn't believe them without financial proof. So, I did what Daniel never expected. I went to someone he'd underestimated, Mira. She'd gone off the grid after her leave, but I still had her old number. I messaged, I found what you warned me about. I have proof. I need your help. Hours later, my phone buzzed. Meet me where we first discussed the audit. That was the cafe across from headquarters. Neutral ground. Mira looked different when I saw her. Tired, wary, but sharper than ever. You're lucky I still care, she said, sipping her coffee. He threatened me, Aiden. Said he'd ruin my career if I didn't stay quiet. I handed her the flash drive with the evidence. He forged my signature. He's been laundering money through shell accounts. I can prove it. She plugged it into her tablet. Scrolling fast, her eyes widened. Oh my God. This is enough to bring him down. But you'll go down too if we don't plan this right. Then we plan it right, I said. That was the moment I stopped being scared. Over the next week, Mira and I built a timeline. Every fake invoice, every forged approval, every transaction linked to his fake Dubai trip. Piece by piece, we turned his scheme into a weapon. We even drafted a confidential report addressed to the board of directors, complete with evidence summaries and a backup cloud link. All that was left was timing. When to strike. On Friday, Daniel announced another business trip, this time to London. I almost laughed. The pattern was too perfect, same lies, same fake calm. He walked past my desk, tapping the folder I was working on. Keep up the great work, Aiden. You're the backbone of this company. I looked up at him, steady and calm. Don't worry, I said. This time, I'll make sure everything's accounted for. He grinned, clueless. I smiled back, knowing he'd just signed his own downfall. Because this time, I wasn't his cover. I was his consequence. You taught me to follow the money, Daniel. I whispered as he left for his fake trip. Now I'm teaching the board to follow you. You don't beat a liar with noise. You beat him with evidence, arranged, timed, and impossible to ignore. After the turning point, fear had evaporated and left a cold kind of clarity. Daniel had woven a pattern of theft around 228,000. Fake vendors, forged approvals, a staged business trip. If I wanted to bring him down, I had to do it the way he understood best, with numbers, paper trails, and airtight provenance. No drama, no leaks. A surgical reveal. I wrote the plan on a single sheet of paper that night and pinned it to my wall like a map to a buried treasure. It had 5 phases. Each one had to work, or everything would collapse. Harden the evidence, collect, duplicate, encrypt. Step 1 was obvious but risky. Gather every single document linking Daniel to the transfers and preserve it offsite. I copied server backups, invoice PDFs, bank confirmation screenshots, the voice memos from the SD card, and Mira's notes. Then I duplicated everything onto 3 encrypted drives, one with me, one with Mira, and one uploaded to a secure, anonymous cloud account we could hand the board. I timestamped each file, kept hash checksums, and printed physical copies with notarized affidavits, drafted by an anonymous legal contact Mira knew. If Daniel tried to claim files were tampered with, the hashes would prove otherwise. Solid provenance was the only antidote to his "I built this system" defense. Build the narrative, threading the transactions into a story. Numbers alone confuse people. You needed an ARCA before, during, and after. I created a clear timeline showing how the $128K left Stratwell, which invoices matched which transfers, the shell companies, and the exact moments Daniel's Dubai trip lined up with the largest withdrawals. Mira and I mocked up a clean, executive, ready dossier, a one-page summary, a detailed ledger, and annexes containing the raw evidence. Each claim in the summary had a footnote linking to the exact file in the archive. This was important. The board should be able to see the headline and click straight to the proof. Plant the traps. Let him think he's safey. This is where playing Daniel's game back at him became crucial. He thrived when people moved funds casually and trusted his signature. So I let him keep thinking he still had control. I continued approving small, meaningless items he asked me to. But I added tags, metadata, and internal comments that looked innocuous to an auditor, but flagged anomalies for the archive. I also fed subtle questions into conversations and emails that would later serve as admissions. When he told a subordinate to clean up the ledger, I made sure the instruction was recorded in an email thread. When he suggested skipping an audit checkpoint, I asked innocently, "Just for this quarter?" Then saved the reply. Every careless ordering word became a recorded string in the case I was building. Recruit quiet allies, legal, HR, and one trusted board contact. I couldn't go directly to the board without putting a buffer between me and the explosion. So I quietly recruited Mira, obvious, the junior legal paralegal who owed me a favor, and a retired auditor I used to tutor during night classes. The paralegal agreed to put the dossier into a legal escalation channel under attorney-client protocol. The retired auditor offered to review the ledger independently and sign a confidentiality statement. Most important, I found a sympathetic board member, Mrs. Patel, an outside director who once complimented my thoroughness after a meeting. I sent her a short, non-accusatory note. "I've noticed irregularities in travel expenses. Could you advise on escalation protocol?" She replied curtly but curiously, enough to know I'd at least get a chance to be heard if I ever presented legally notarized evidence. Timing and the reveal, strike when he's most exposed. Daniel loved the theater of a last-minute scramble. He scheduled his fake trips during board weeks and used those moments as cover. So we decided to strike precisely when he announced another trip. A predictable move. The plan: hand the dossier to Mrs. Patel and the independent auditor early on the morning the board package was distributed. Then quietly CC the CEO's legal counsel with the notarized affidavit and hashed evidence links. That way, when the board opened their meeting materials, the proof would already be in play and the chain of custody unbroken. We would not accuse in the hallway or post a dramatic video. This had to be quiet, professional, and irreversible. The board process would finish us or absolve us, but it would be their decision, not a smear campaign. Everything sounded precise on paper. In reality, the execution was a minefield. Daniel still walked around with that unflappable smile, cracking jokes with the CEO, and handing out cheap souvenirs like he owned the building. He never once seemed worried, which only made me more certain the timing was right. If he thought he was untouchable, he'd be careless, and careless meant more evidence. Two things kept me awake the nights before the strike. First, the black SUV that had rolled past my car weeks ago. I assumed Daniel had eyes on me. Second, the knowledge that one misstep, a deleted file, an overheard conversation, a panicked denial, could redirect suspicion onto me. He had taught me how to be the perfect scapegoat. Now those lessons were my blueprint to trap him. The week we'd chosen, Daniel announced yet another urgent meeting, overseas. He kissed the CEO on the cheek and left for the airport with his practiced calm. When he was in the air, I pulled the trigger: encrypted packet to Mrs. Patel, notarized docket to legal, printed dossier into HR's secured inbox, independent auditors signed review uploaded to the board portal. And then I waited. The waiting was a different kind of torment, louder and heavier than any action. Daniel still had the stage. He still controlled the daily interactions. But he no longer controlled the truth. He thought he was 2 steps ahead. I had spent months mapping his every footfall. The board would now see the trail. A neat, undeniable path from fake invoices to his accounts, annotated with email admissions and voice memos. When the CEO's PA called my desk, asking why legal had escalated an anonymous dossier, I kept my voice steady. That was the final test. If I cracked, everything would collapse. If I didn't, the board process would begin. And with it, the moment Daniel would discover that the person he'd groomed, the one he'd planned to bury under forged signatures, had become the architect of his undoing. "You taught me to follow the money?" I'd told him. Now the money was walking straight into a room full of people who could stop him. The climax was close enough to taste. Daniel still smiled like a man in control. But behind that smile, a storm was already forming. And I'd spent months learning to make it rain. The loudest sound in a quiet room isn't a shout. It's the clicking of a USB being inserted. The moment proof finds a pulse. Board day arrived with a gray sky that made the glass tower across from Stratwell look like a tombstone. I walked to the meeting room carrying nothing dramatic, a slim folder, 2 encrypted drives, and the weight of every sleepless night. Mira sat beside me, calm and pale. The retired auditor in the corner nodding like a co-conspirator in a slow, careful plan. The CEO led them in 7 faces, practiced and polite. The kind of people used to smoothing storms, not watching them drown in paperwork. Daniel was not in the room. He had, as always, an urgent client meeting overseas. He'd even sent a smug video from the airport sunglasses, a boarding pass half visible, the usual reassurance that he was untouchable. Mrs. Patel waited until the CEO had spoken, then opened the folder I'd given her. The room went quiet the way the ocean does before a wave hits. "We received an escalation from internal counsel," she said. "There are alleged irregularities in Q3-Q4 travel and consulting expenses." "Mrs. Patel, could you summarize?" I didn't speak. I let my work do it. Mrs. Patel clicked the first PDF. The dossier was clean and surgical timeline. Ledger matching, hashed evidence. The auditor explained, quietly and plainly, how each invoice routed money to shell accounts, and finally into D. Ross Holdings. An account tied by documentation to Daniel. Daniel's video winked out mid-flight when the board's legal counsel sent him a terse message. "Return to headquarters immediately." He didn't. He tried to calm things with more emails. Vague defenses. Claims of strategic maneuvers, the old chestnut. "I built the system. If I'm accused, it's corporate sabotage." But the proof had fingerprints, timestamps, and an audio backbone he couldn't erase. Mrs. Patel scrolled to the audio file labeled, "Move the funds," and hit play. Daniel's voice filled the room like a rope being pulled taut. "Move the funds to the consulting account." "No, don't copy the board on this. Aiden's signature is on file, just process it." Heads turned toward me. I felt every eye like a flashlight. Daniel's calm, recorded cadence. The same tone he used when he'd told me to trust him. Now accused him louder than any legal brief could. He still denied it, in public emails and a frantic series of calls to the CEO. But then the auditor pointed to the printed ledger. The account numbers, the matching transfers, the invoices created on company time stamped from inside the Stratwell network. The hashes matched the notarized affidavits we'd sent. The legal counsel had already confirmed chain of custody. There was no plausible explanation. Daniel's fallback was to attack me. "This is an internal smear," he wrote to the board. "An attempt to ruin a career." He tried to claim the audio was doctored, and the signatures fabricated from a downloaded template. That was when Mira did what I couldn't do without shattering in front of everyone. She rose, her voice steady, and presented the backup logs, system snapshots showing when documents were created, who accessed them, and by which IP addresses. One log showed a query from Daniel's workstation at 2:14 a.m. on a Sunday. Another showed the same files being moved to a removable device at 20:21 a.m. The SD card, the stupid souvenir's secret, had been plugged in at 20:22 a.m. The timestamps were surgical, the pattern was obvious. "Mr. Ross," the CEO said, quieter than I expected, "explaining this will be difficult." Then the room's phone chimed. The legal counsel read a short message from the bank. A freeze had been placed on the accounts flagged in the dossier pending regulatory inquiry. Simultaneously, the independent auditor's report, uploaded earlier that morning, pinged every board member's inbox. An executive summary stating unequivocally that 228,000 in diverted funds matched Daniel's directives. Daniel tried one last move, a livestream statement from his hotel shouting innocence, invoking competitive pressures and misunderstandings. The board watched it together, and for the first time, I saw a fissure in his performative confidence. In the video, his voice wavered. He reached for the old intimidation tactics. The threats, the charming deflections. But the evidence had already eaten the ground from under him. Mrs. Paddle closed her tablet slowly. On the basis of the documentation presented, the board will convene an emergency session, she said. Until the investigation concludes, Mr. Ross is suspended with immediate effect and asked not to enter company premises. We will hand this dossier to regulatory authorities. Her words landed like a gavel. Outside the room, the world kept spinning, unaware. Inside, Daniel's world stopped. The CEO excused himself to make immediate calls. Security circulated a short statement. HR locked accounts. The legal counsel sent a request for cooperation to law enforcement. The black SUV that had tailed me weeks ago. It idled across the street, its occupants watching like vultures. Now they watched a different kind of hunt. Then the climax came in a way no spreadsheet could have predicted. A minute after the board's decision, the CEO's PA burst through the doors, breathless. She'd intercepted Daniel at the airport during a layover. He'd been detained by private security pending police arrival. An overzealous move, the PA said, but it bought time. Seeds of panic had sprouted. Daniel's family members were calling the office, their voices threaded with disbelief and shame. A single newsroom, tipped by a source within legal, picked up the story. The headline overnight would not be kind. That evening, a press release quietly went out. Stratwell Industries announces suspension of CFO, pending investigation into financial irregularities. It contained the board's statement and an assurance of cooperation with authorities. It was neutral, sterile. But the court of public opinion isn't neutral. By the time I left the building, the city lights were blurred by rain. Reporters circled like moths. My phone buzzed with messages. Some supportive, others vicious. I expected a release of anger from Daniel, a last gasping attempt to smear me. Instead, I got a single text from an unknown number. You'll regret this. I read it and smiled, the kind of smile that's half relief, half exhaustion. The board had acted. The accounts were frozen. Daniel's runway was gone. He had faked a trip to vanish from accountability. He had faked his way through audits and lunches and mentorships. But he hadn't faked one thing. The digital trail he left everywhere he touched. I walked to my car under the yellow spill of a street lamp, and kept thinking of the elevator mirror that had started this. His face reflected in the same building where he would now be judged. The city hummed a slow chorus of consequence. The climax had landed. The fallout would take its time. You taught me to follow the money, Daniel. I whispered into the rain. Tonight it followed you back. When the truth finally burns through the paper, it doesn't ask permission. It just lights the match and watches the lies collapse. 3 months after the board meeting, the silence in Stratwell's executive wing was almost eerie. The office that once belonged to Daniel Ross, polished desk, imported espresso machine, the smug aura of invincibility, now stood empty. His nameplate had been quietly removed. HR didn't even replace it. The brass screws remained like scars. Daniel's downfall hadn't just been corporate. It was total. The forensic audit had concluded that over the course of 18 months, he'd siphoned $228,000 through fake consulting firms and travel expenses, masking them as strategic ventures. When the regulators stepped in, they found more. Ghost vendors, duplicate invoices, even falsified signatures from overseas partners. What had started as an internal review had become a criminal case. He tried to fight it, of course. Hired the best defense attorney money could still buy. But every shred of evidence was time-stamped, notarized, and backed by independent verification. The board handed over full cooperation. The final blow came when the prosecutor played the voice memo in court: move the funds. Don't copy the board. That single sentence, arrogant, confident, careless, became his undoing. Daniel Ross, once the youngest CFO in Stratwell's history, was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. When the verdict was read, he didn't look at me. He didn't have to. The silence between us had already said everything. In the weeks that followed, Stratwell reshaped itself like a body healing from infection. The board issued new transparency policies. Expense tracking went digital, with multi-person approvals. Every senior manager was required to attend ethics training. A quiet acknowledgement of how deep Daniel's shadow had reached. And me, the quiet one in the background, the man he used to call my protégé, I got promoted. The CEO called me into his office one rainy morning, hands clasped, eyes tired but grateful. "You didn't just save the company, Aiden," he said. "You saved our credibility." Most people would have looked away. The title on my new doorplate read Director of Corporate Integrity. I didn't laugh, though part of me wanted to. The irony was poetic. I'd spent months buried under Daniel's lies, and now I was being paid to make sure no one else could ever build one that big again. But success doesn't wash the stains off easily. Some nights, I'd wake up at 3 a.m., convinced I'd hear his voice again, that same charming tone whispering strategy, promising mentorship. Betrayal lingers, even after justice. It's not the lies that hurt most. It's realizing you believed them. Mira and I grew close in the aftermath. She was my anchor when I started to unravel. "He trained you to protect his secrets," she'd say. "And you turned that training into a weapon against him." That thought steadied me. Poetic symmetry wrapped in pain. One day, after everything settled, we went to the old conference room, the one where Daniel used to hold his Monday briefings. We stood there for a long while, silent. Then Mira said softly, "You notice something? The air doesn't feel heavy anymore." And she was right, it didn't. When the press release hit mainstream media, the story spread faster than I expected. CFO's fake business trip uncovered $128K fraud. News anchors said the number like it was a curse. Online forums tore him apart, his arrogance, his greed, his "I'm untouchable" grin from old photos. But there was one detail I hadn't anticipated: how many people reached out to me privately. Emails from ex-employees, even strangers. Some said, "You did what we couldn't." Others confessed they'd been in similar situations. Silenced, manipulated, afraid to speak up. That was when I realized the story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a mirror, reflecting everyone who'd ever been deceived by someone in power. Last I heard, Daniel's assets were seized. His luxury apartment, sold. His consulting network, dismantled. The final poetic touch, the fake shell company he used to funnel money, Echelon Dynamics LLC, was bought by Stratwell itself during liquidation and rebranded as a transparency fund for employee scholarships. His own creation now funds the education of interns, the very people he used to exploit for free work. That was justice, not just poetic, but cyclical. A few months later, the board held a recognition event. I didn't expect to be called up. When they handed me the plaque, I hesitated, not because of pride, but because I knew what it had cost. I'd lost sleep, trust, and maybe a little faith in people. But standing there, I understood something deeper: betrayal doesn't just destroy. It defines. It sharpens the edges of who you are. It teaches you where your boundaries begin, and where courage finally takes over. And when you walk through that fire and come out the other side, you don't need revenge to feel whole. You just need truth. A few weeks later, I visited the corporate storage vault to close the case files. The USB drive, the one that held every piece of evidence, sat in a sealed envelope, marked ARCHI Vetti. I placed it in the drawer, paused and whispered, "You faked a trip to escape the truth, Daniel. I took that trip for you, and brought the truth home." I turned off the light and walked out of the archive room. The door shut with a quiet click. The kind of sound that ends a chapter. If you've ever been betrayed by a boss, a partner, or someone who used your loyalty as their weapon, I want you to hear this. You don't need to scream to be powerful. You don't need revenge to win. You just need the truth, and the courage to let it speak louder than the lies. Because sometimes, the greatest justice is simply being the one still standing when the liar runs out of places to hide. Have you ever caught someone lying at work? Or had a boss betray your trust? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story hit home, hit subscribe, because more real, life revenge stories like this one are coming your way. He faked a business trip to hide his crime. I turned it into his one-way ticket to downfall.